it is prediction time. I want to go over my predictions for the fantasy genre for the next, decade or so. The fantasy genre is always evolving, from the high-stake epics of Tolkien to the gritty realism of Grimdark, and now the rise of cozy fantasy and romantasy. Each generation reinvents the genre to suit its own dreams and fears. And as we look ahead to the next decade, the question isn't just what's next, but where is fantasy headed? Based on current patterns, emerging authors, reader communities, and wider cultural movements, here are a bunch of trends that I think are likely going to define the future of fantasy fiction, and in some cases already are on the rise. The days of neatly categorized subgenres are fading. We're entering an age where fantasy freely merges with horror, sci-fi, romance, mystery, and even slice of life or cozy core. And I think we can expect more stories that feel like they shouldn't work on paper, but absolutely do. And I'm gonna talk about some of these genres in more depth later in the video, but with all these genre-bending stories becoming the norm, what about the classics? Is epic fantasy being left in the dust? I have seen this trend all over BookTube lately, saying that epic fantasy is dying, like it's a well-established fact. I don't think so at all. I don't agree with that. Sure, just like anything in pop culture, modern fantasy is going to have different eras and different trends that peak and then fall off. At least in my eyes, epic fantasy is not a trend. I think there's always going to be an appeal for a great epic. But I mean, it's never really the big subgenre that appeals to the masses unless there's some big adaptation like Game of Thrones. Epic fantasy is just more difficult to get into for people that don't read a lot of fantasy. I mean, you're dealing with multiple points of view, you're dealing with complex plots and subplots, not to mention just like huge world building on an epic scale. It's spanning kingdoms and cultures and time frames, political intrigue, and pages of lore. Epic fantasy is a lot to take in, so it may not be the next big hit on TikTok, but epic fantasy isn't going anywhere, and neither are its fans. This video isn't just focused on epic fantasy, but that's just something I wanted to address right away. I've also seen a lot of voices say that Grimdark is dying with the lack of Winds of Winter. Have you read Joe Abercrombie, Brian Lee Durfee, R.F. Kuang, Evan Winter, Steven Erikson? Honestly, I think grimdark and medieval-themed fantasy is always going to have a spot in the genre. I think there's just too much of an appeal for that type of fantasy. But what I do think is going to continue to be welcomed into grimdark and epic fantasy is the rise of more diverse cultures, especially from like Eastern Europe and whatnot. And we're already seeing a lot of that in fantasy with acclaimed titles like The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang, Sons of Darkness by Gaurav Mohanty. I was just reading here. This is a really great grimdark that's inspired by like Indian folktales and mythology. Highly recommend this one. Also, Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter, a great African-inspired fantasy that's kind of grimdark revenge story. Getting fantasy with more diverse cultures and inspirations is something I'm really excited to see. It's gonna keep fantasy fresh, seeing something that's different than the classic medieval Europe fantasy setting, which I still enjoy, and I don't think that's going anywhere. I think there's always an appeal for that, but it's nice to get different perspectives and read something that's new to you. Now, if you work at a bookstore right now, you know the biggest, hottest, and most influential authors are leaning more towards writing lighter stories, or even spicy stories. You may even be a little afraid to spread those pages because it's smut, okay? A lot of it is smut. I'm talking 10% fantasy, 90% romanticized trauma, and dragon or fae smut. Hey, each to their own. Romantasy is huge at the moment, with authors like Sarah J. Maas and Rebecca Yarros. Now, this is marketed a lot through TikTok and Instagram Reels and YouTube Shorts, and that's really helped the rise in popularity. I feel like this is kind of a trend. But also it's kind of always been there, I think. It's always been there. And it doesn't seem to be dying anytime soon. I don't think it's going to. I think it's going to continue to rise in popularity until it's so oversaturated with romanticized toxic relationships than it already is. Okay, maybe I'm being a bit unfair. I'm not trying to call out all Romantasy. I know there is some gems out there. There's some great Romantasy series out there. Just there's also a lot of poorly written trash that blows up on TikTok and makes the author millions, despite being very bad examples for like a healthy relationship. Toxicity isn't sexy. Neither is physical or emotional abuse. A lot of the six-figure deals in fantasy right now are going to romantasy or cozy fantasy, and not just the low figures. I'm aware of a few that are 500k and up. Man, maybe I should write a romantasy, like a Fourth Wing fanfiction or something. That could be my success story. Now in the next few years, I know we're gonna see a lot more romance fantasy, even if it isn't explicitly advertised as romance fantasy. Not that I don't like romance, I actually like reading romance, I just like it to be part of the story and not the main feature of the story. And also, I'm just not really the demographic for reading smut, but you know, it's there for those that enjoy it.
Readers are popularizing the romantasy genre, but there's so much more to the trend than reading books. It's become a cultural movement.
Like I said, romantasy isn't new. It's pretty much been dominating for over a decade. But in recent years, thanks to BookTok, the genre has blown up to insane levels. I mean, Onyx Storm sold 2.7 million copies in the first week.
This morning when this book was released, a lot of our colleagues racing to the store to pick it up early today.
Publishers are actively promoting these books over others because romantasy is where the money is at right now. Sometimes you just want to read a fluffy, easy fantasy, a popcorn read, and there's a place for that. I don't think there's any shame in wanting to read that. I just don't think these books should also be put on a pedestal as the best of the best. I do think it's great that we're seeing so many books being sold and so many people still reading, and if romantasy is getting more people reading fiction, that's always a plus. I just hope that these readers might also branch off and explore more of the genre instead of just reading the next viral sensation. And, well, that's the thing. Books have become a commercially driven industry like everything else. Most of these viral books are written to sell. They're not some deep story the author is pouring from their heart or spent a decade crafting and perfecting. And again, I'm not calling out every romantasy novel. Reading in any form is always a great hobby, it's always beneficial, but a lot of these books have just made it capitalistic, and to me, that is sad. And my prediction is that this is going to continue to grow, unfortunately. But as the novelty starts to fade, hopefully we're gonna see a rise in more well-crafted, well-written romantasy novels. Ones that stand out from all the rest. Okay, Editing Jay here. I feel like maybe I'm still being too harsh on romantasy. I don't really know. Maybe I'm just ignorant and I haven't really read enough or explored enough of that genre. I did try to change that recently. I read a book that just sounded interesting to me, and I've seen a lot of people recommend it as like an actual good romantasy novel, and that was One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig. This was actually a really interesting book. I enjoyed this one quite a bit. The audiobook was fantastic as well. So yeah, I'm not too sure. I still stand by my statements, but I'm sure there's still gems out there that I just haven't read myself. I did read the first like 3 Throne of Glass novels back when I first made my channel, and I see the appeal for those, but I didn't think they were anything special. I didn't think they were really that great, and obviously I'm not the demographic for Throne of Glass, so maybe that's why. But for me, I guess it just kind of bothers me when things that aren't that quality get so much publicity over other books that are extremely well written. So I don't know. Let me know your thoughts on romantasy in the comments. Let me know if I'm being too harsh. Also, how sick, I just got an Akira box set. Let me show you. Akira is one of my favorite movies of all time, and now I have the full hardcover box set of the manga, which looks absolutely beautiful. Anyways, that has nothing to do with the video. I just wanted to flex. And hear me out, because I consider myself a hopeless romantic. I love romance stories. I like watching chick flicks and The Bachelor with Katie. The problem I have, I guess, with Romantasy is just when so much of it that's being heavily pushed is more so like erotica with very toxic relationships, and that's the stuff that's like super popular. I just don't understand. I don't understand it. I don't know, maybe I'm old-fashioned, maybe erotica is where it's at. Let me know your recommendation. Also, cozy fantasy is a genre that's just starting to be defined. I actually have a full video planned on cozy fantasy that I want to make soon. But authors like Travis Baldree and TJ Klune and T. Kingfisher are some of the big names when it comes to writing comfort reads with low stakes and a lot of emotional resonance. I definitely see a surge in cozy fantasy as well as dark academia, and possibly a resurgence of urban fantasy on its way. I'm excited to see who's going to be the next big, like, Jim Butcher. I want to see the next Dresden Files. But of all the mixed genres, the one I'm most interested in seeing how it develops is the rise of fantasy horror. Listen, Between Two Fires by Christopher Buehlman and The Library at Mount Char by Scott Hawkins were both some of my favorite recent reads. I highly recommend them, and I've been gravitating towards the more darker and more suspenseful books lately. Books that tackle more serious or complex themes and have an unsettling atmosphere that makes you just not want to put it down. So I would really like to see this become the next big thing. I've been made aware of a bunch of other fantasy horror novels that I need to read. I'm planning on reading more of The Dark Tower this year and also starting on Clive Barker's work, but if there's any recommendations that you have, let me know in the comments. Now, as technology and publishing evolves, so will the way that we experience fantasy. I think we're going to see a lot more audiobook first releases, interactive apps, and serialized fiction or web novels will become more popular. And some authors might even write books specifically designed for digital first formats. I recently watched a video by Austin McConnell about this fully interactive novella.
So there's this book that came out about 10 years ago called The Vanishing Game by William Boyd. It wasn't a regular book. It was this fully interactive online experience commissioned by, of all companies, Land Rover in 2014.
And despite being sponsored by Land Rover, the novella was actually a pretty solid adventure thriller that sparked a lot of talk online. And it was a full multimedia experience accompanied by video, illustrations, animations, and sound effects, and unfortunately the site doesn't exist anymore, but I'm really interested in the idea of interactive or multimedia storytelling, and I think we're gonna see a lot more experimentation of this over the next decade. Now, obviously, this would take a lot more production, resources, and effort. It wouldn't be an easy thing to pull off, but it would be so interesting to see how this develops, and I'm really hoping we will see more interactive fiction like this. Obviously, it's not going to replace the physical book, but it could be a way to get more people into reading. And since I'm talking about technology and publishing, I need to address AI. Unfortunately, AI is here whether we like it or not, and I can see a place for AI. I use AI as like an assistant, and I feel like that's kind of the best way to use it. But it seems to be very unregulated right now, and we continue to see more books being written by AI somehow end up on Amazon, and it's all very disheartening, I feel like. I'm hoping that at some point in this decade there will be a crackdown and more regulations with AI, especially when it comes to writing fiction and people trying to sell books written by AI to make a quick dollar. I'm really hoping that there will be a crackdown on that. We've seen a lot of success in progression fantasy, and I think this is going to continue to grow. Now, the whole appeal of progression fantasy is how it focuses in on the characters and their growth and power scaling, and it offers readers a satisfying sense of accomplishment as the protagonist overcome challenges and become stronger. Now, the crazy Cradle series by Will White has a huge dedicated fan base, and it became one of the best-selling self-published series in recent years. And the same can also be said for He Who Fights with Monsters, so I think it's safe to assume that both LitRPG and progression fantasy are going to continue to do quite well, but also that we're gonna see a rise in more successful self-published books. And yeah, I'm sure we're gonna see a lot of low-quality books being released, and more than a handful of them are gonna be revealed to be written by AI, but on the flip side, I do think we're likely gonna see some huge success stories, and perhaps even something of a boom in self-publishing. And I'm really hoping the series that I'm writing will help with that boom. Now, while I do think that Grimdark is still going to be popular, I think we're going to see a broader shift to more optimistic works, and even more politically charged works, in the same vein of like Ursula K. Le Guin. And I wouldn't be surprised if Flintlock fantasy or revolutionary era fantasy would become more prominent. And with people being exhausted by cynicism and constant crisis in real life, the next big movement in fantasy might lean more into optimism, hope punk and solarpunk, stories that emphasize resistance, compassion, and community. And specifically solarpunk focuses on the utopia and aesthetics of lush green cities and sustainable magic and technology. And we have seen a bit of a rise in solarpunk stories recently, and maybe we're gonna see more of that. Now, with attention spans dwindling, not everyone has time for 1,000-page epics anymore, and there's a growing hunger for complete stories told with economy and punch. So fantasy novellas, standalones, even duologies, I think we're gonna see a lot more of this, and not just because of time constraints, but because readers want emotional payoffs without a 10-year commitment. Books like The Sword of Kaigen or Nettle and Bone are great examples, but if you want more standalone recommendations, I made a full top 10 video talking about my favorites. Now, the theme of climate change and climate disaster has been a major theme in fantasy and sci-fi for quite a while now, and I think this is just going to continue to become more popular, and not just fantasy that has apocalyptic wastelands, but also worlds grappling with ecological magic, crumbling empires, and post-collapse rebuilding. We could have a new wave of eco-fantasy that doesn't just escape the real world, but reimagines how to survive it. Now, complex hard magic systems are going to continue to play a big role in fantasy. I mean, Brandon Sanderson had a big influence when it came to developing a really unique magic system, and we've seen plenty of other authors replicate that and deliver some really interesting magic systems. The Will of the Many by James Islington is one of my favorite new hard magic systems, as well as the Green Bone Saga by Fonda Lee. Now, I'm not saying these authors are necessarily inspired by Brandon Sanderson. I'm just saying that obviously Sanderson's work has had a big influence on that becoming more popular. There's plenty of hard magic systems before Sanderson. Robert Jordan had a really great complex magic system as well. Now, I've also been seeing a lot of discussion online from people who are growing tired of these type of magic systems, and they want more of a mysterious, otherworldly magic. They want a return of soft magic systems, and this is magic that can serve more of like a metaphorical purpose. You don't need to understand the inner workings of how everything works. Gandalf can just do his magic and we can believe it. And there's an argument to be said that this feels much more like the essence of fantasy. So I do think we're gonna see a lot more soft magic systems return as people begin to get burnt out on the Sanderson-like magic systems. LitRPG has been rising in the genre right now. It's been getting a lot of readers. I'm currently making my way through an indie LitRPG called The Grand Game by Tom Elliott, and I'm enjoying it. Also, the Wandering Inn by Pirate Abba is incredible. My favorite LitRPG definitely is still Dungeon Crawler Carl by Matt Dinniman. It is by far the best LitRPG I've read, and apparently it's getting like a TV or movie adaptation, and I feel like if that adaptation does well, then LitRPG is just going to skyrocket in popularity. I'm excited to see some of the rising stars in LitRPG. I feel like it's a genre that definitely has a lot of low quality in it as well, but there is some gems that truly stand out. Anyways, those are just some of my predictions. Let me know yours down in the comments.